All right, it is 1:30 and I'm ready to get started on the heavy equipment webinar. This one's a different one than I guess my standard webinars. This is really designed to help you teach your folks or teach your operators, because there is a lack of training out there for our folks that are operating heavy equipment. So this is a little bit different. There is a ton of materials attached in here if you click your materials tab, and we'll go over that here in just a second. There's 6 different attachments, including this PowerPoint, so you can take all this information and relay it to your employees that are operating this heavy equipment. But to start off, let's just go over the controls. You should have a toolbar in your upper right-hand corner, and on that toolbar, there's an orange button that's your grab tab, and that opens or closes the menu. You've got a mute or unmute button. I've got everybody muted right now, so I'm just getting some strange feedback. So, the best way to communicate would be through the chat screen, and you can type in the message in the smaller box. You can pick who you want to send it to in the toolbar down below, and then you can just send it off, and it will go to either me or the whole group or another person attending the webinar. There is a webcam button that doesn't really do anything, and then there's also a hand raise button if you have a specific question. But really, anything, if you have any questions or you can't get the materials, just get a hold of me via email, and I will get you, all of the attachments, because there have been some issues with just a couple folks of being able to download the attachments. But all right, let's get into it. And once again, this webinar is designed to help you teach your employees, about heavy equipment, and just really we want to identify what the most common hazards are and what we need to do to avoid those hazards. It really is that simple. So we want to go over a little bit of how they're different, and I was honestly surprised by this, and then I looked up the weights of just front end loaders, which a lot of us have, and they go anywhere from 26,000 pounds to almost 300,000 pounds. Whereas with automobiles, you're around 1,400 to maybe 6,400. Oh, you got a typo right there. Another big difference is the cost of these machines. The heavy equipment is significantly more expensive than your average car. They are literally moving tons of dirt or wood or whatever it may be, and that kind of gives us a sense of invulnerability. The controls are vastly different. Every single piece of equipment is different, whereas most cars are essentially the same. And then we have many different manufacturers, and they're all different. The visibility is significantly less with heavy equipment, and then one of the other more difficult things to manage is where we're working. Is that the location is almost always changing where we're working out with heavy equipment. And just to pull up the numbers, the most recent numbers, in 2016 we had 1,065 incidents, serious incidents with heavy equipment, and the 2/3 of those almost were fatal. And we had 338 that were non-fatal. But what really surprised me is that the majority were just people on the ground. They were not the operators that were getting hurt. You had some where the operators are getting hurt, but the vast majority was the person on the ground. And then the type of incident, once again, the heavy majority of it is actually being struck by the machine itself, being run over by the machine itself. And you got some pretty good numbers for people getting caught in it or between the machine and something else. So when you kind of lump those two together, you've got a significant majority of a lot of these incidents are the machine running somebody over or crushing somebody. And then the age of the victim I found very interesting is that you've got a huge majority of these again that are 29 and younger. And so I think what happens is as we get older, we get more experienced, and I think we get hopefully a little bit better judgment, because the numbers just keep decreasing as the age of as the age gets higher. So the hazards that are what's causing issues or what's causing these incidents is that people are not using the equipment the way the manufacturer instructed. We've had incidents of people getting caught in, the moving parts, or being actually, this is relatively common in our industries, where they get hit by a bucket or forks that are elevated above them, and those will come down on people. Their equipment fires from, plants and debris and everything underneath the equipment itself. And then we've had a high number of injuries from people actually falling off the equipment while getting on or off of it. We've had people getting run over by the equipment. We see, a couple times a year where we actually have rollovers. Thankfully, we don't see too much of making contact with power lines. That is something we need to be significantly concerned about. And then I do see some issues with where we're operating defective equipment. And the hearing loss is one you won't see, right away. That's something that you'll see in your operators, 5, 10, 15 years down the road. So doing the inspections of your equipment is mission critical. I think you got to make sure the thing's even worthy of being started up. And we're required to do one at the beginning of every shift, every day we operate the equipment. And I get a lot of questions of when do I need to pull my equipment from service? If you've got a backup alarm or a horn that's not working, it needs to be pulled. If you've got a defective or missing fire extinguisher, the piece of equipment's got to be, it's got to be parked and pulled. If you got a defective or missing seatbelt, brake problems, if there were mirrors that the manufacturer installed that are missing, then the equipment's got to be pulled out of service. If you got cracked or missing glass, the doors won't shut or won't latch. You got fluid leaks or any other, safety or health hazard likely to cause harm, you need to be pulling that equipment out of service. That first line from the backup to the mirrors, you absolutely, as per the standard, have got to pull that machine out of service. This is a almost brand new piece of equipment at one of my accounts, and the very first thing we did to it was cut the backup alarm. If the manufacturer put it on there, it has to be functional. So, like I said, this piece of equipment wasn't even a week old. So yeah, we had to repair it, and people had to get used to hearing the backup alarm. But they're required. It's not an optional. It's not an optional piece of equipment. What I do have huge concerns about is people being seen by the operator. The visibility inside the cab of it doesn't matter whether it's a bulldozer or a front end loader or a dump truck, although there's not too many of us running those. It's really restricted, whether it's by the attachment itself, what we're carrying, the cage or the protective equipment. And so we need to train not only our operators to be looking for people, but we need to train our people that are on the ground that they need to put themselves in a position to be seen. And it may seem kind of simple, but it is a bad habit, we'll say, of a lot of my folks walking on the ground, where they walk alongside it and they're in a blind spot where the operator can't see them, and all it takes is them turning or shifting the load that they're carrying, and we got an incident. So of course we want to make eye contact and kind of get their approval, I guess, or their acknowledgement before we approach the machine. So we've got to teach this both to our operators and our people on the ground. I do see a lot of this where we're talking to the operator, and we'll either be like standing on the tracks, or we'll be in between the vehicle and the heavy equipment and where they can run us over going forward. Or I have actually seen people behind it tying their shoes. So we got to put ourselves in a, teach our folks to put themselves in a position where they can be seen. All right, so just to give you a sense, I don't know if this chart makes any sense, but this is a very common sized Caterpillar bulldozer. And the gray areas are where they can't see anything at all, where they're completely blind. And if you'll notice, there's huge blind spots, with this piece of equipment. And so we need to teach our folks, where, kind of what angles to approach from. And once again, this PowerPoint is attached. And, like I said, it is for you to train your people. That's what, the whole point of putting this thing together is. So, once again, if you can't get the attachments, just let me know and I'll email them to you. And, we'll go from there. What I do see a lot of statistically, the most common injury I see from my heavy equipment operators is from them jumping out of the cab. I have a lot of knee injuries and shoulder injuries and ankle injuries from operators basically jumping out of the cab. So in addition to parking it and parking in a good place, so we don't get things rolling out of control, and we got to get people in the habit of setting their parking brake and dropping their attachments to the ground. We also need to really get in their head the 3 points of contact. And what happens is as we get older, we tend to do less of this, but I have a ton of shoulder and knee injuries, and they all were preceded by, I was getting out of the cab of the equipment and jumped off the track or jumped off the last step. We just need to be slow and deliberate and maintain 3 points of contact. The seatbelts, we've got to get people in the habit of wearing seatbelts. It's our best protection. That, God forbid, they roll it over. It literally may save your life. This was not an intended picture, but when we were putting this together, one of my operators' shoelaces were untied and were actually hanging out of the cab of the equipment. So we threw that slide in here. But what has happened, and he's had this happen before, kind of humorously, but it got caught in the pedals. So, it may seem like kind of a silly thing, but we do need to train our folks to, tie their shoelaces, double knot them if they've got to, and just check them over the course of the day, because there have been incidents where somebody stepped on their own shoelace and tripped and fell out of the cab of the vehicle when they were dismounting. I do see a lot of this where there's, tools and parts and cans of spray paint and grease guns and everything rolling around in that cab. And my concern with that is it getting underneath the pedals. So we can't stop or we can't move a direction we need to. So, got to keep the cabs clear, make a spot for the tools and the equipment and stuff to be held. Unless it's absolutely necessary, keep it out of the cab. And then, I see a decent amount of this, but just want to remove any hazards that we can trip on, whether it's, an oil rag or a coat or, our shoelaces are untied. We just want to make that step area and the platform and everything is safe and clear. What I do, and recently we had an incident where a mechanic got caught, thankfully did not get injured, but was trapped in a front end loader. He was working on the hydraulics and had not actually let out the pressure, and took off one of the lines, and the front end loader articulated and basically trapped him in between the two parts of the front end loader. Once again, thankfully, he did not get hurt, but these pieces of equipment, the vast majority have come with a support or a sleeve to go over these hydraulic or over these rams to keep them from, coming down on you. So we've got to use that. This may be one where it's less of talking to our operator and more of talking to our maintenance guys. But we've got to make sure we're cribbing or chalking or blocking or chaining up, whatever we've got to do to keep this equipment from coming down on us while we're working on it. Once again, we don't have too many issues with this, but this is one that's of a high level of concern, because when the bad thing happens with power lines, you tend to have significant property damage, and when there is an injury, it tends to be fatal. But if we're working your power lines, we've got to have a spotter. That spotter's got to have a real clear view of the power line and the operator, so they've got to be standing in the right space. And you may actually depending on the situation, you may be required to have a person dedicated only to just that. That's all they do, is watch the equipment and the power line the entire time you're working around it. So the regulation is you keep at least 10 feet away. It's okay to be even further than 10 feet. If you can, absolutely get as far away from those power lines as you can. Also though, don't forget about the underground lines either. You are required to call 811 2 working days before you dig. This photograph on the left was actually they were hauling a piece of equipment on a flatbed and actually struck the power lines and tore them down. It was pretty expensive mistake to make. But it's not just when we're working around them. It could be when we're transporting. But you hit you hit power lines of the right voltage, and it will actually burn the tires off of that, off of the equipment. And if you're in something with steel tracks, it's going to conduct all the way to the ground. And not too many of us are dealing with these, but I put this picture in there because I was on this job site and ended up walking into one of these guy lines and cleaned myself out. But they are required to be visible. These guys have a good start, but we need to be hanging more flags off of these. And once again, not too many of us are dealing with these, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But you are required to have a fire extinguisher on every single piece of heavy equipment, and it has to be inspected, annually at a minimum. We should be inspecting them monthly, but every single piece of heavy equipment has to have a fire extinguisher on it. Attachments. This one, they're lacking the safety pin or a keeper to hold the attachment in place. They've got it hooked up, but there's actually supposed to be a safety pin that you have to remove in order to detach it. This, they can technically, inside the cab, take the attachment off, but you've got to have the safety pins, and don't put your finger in there. I have had somebody they were working on a backhoe and changing the bucket out, and they stuck their finger in the hole, and the load shifted and it trapped their finger inside the bucket. Don't be, even if it's full of dirt or whatever, blow it out, wash it out. Don't be sticking your fingers in there. You're required to have an operator's manual. If you don't have one, a paper copy of it, which a lot of us don't. It exists online. So you have to have an operator's manual, and the manufacturer and OSHA and everybody recommends that we take a look at it, periodically, I think is what the standard says. There should be warning labels and data plates on all this equipment. These are on here because there have been fatalities related to this type of incident, and that's how we get those warning stickers on there. They are required to be on there, required to be legible. Most of these pieces of equipment are operating at well over 85 decibels, so we should be training our folks to be wearing hearing protection while they're on it. And like I said, you don't see this, immediately. You'll see it 10, 15, 20 years down the road where a heavy equipment operator starts to lose their hearing. And then, on top of that, of somebody losing their hearing, we've also got an OSHA recordable because we had a standard threshold shift on their hearing. Mount and dismount, we've already covered this a little bit, but this is where I see the highest number of injuries are from people jumping off the thing. Of course, you got to wear your seatbelt. And if you do tip over, we need to teach our operators to plant their feet. Do not try to jump out of it, and hold on to something, whether it's the seat, the handles of the steering wheel, and then lean away from impact. We do every year get a couple at least equipment turnovers, and we found that it really comes down to people wearing their seatbelts or not, whether or not they get really hurt. You're going to get banged up if you roll a piece of equipment, but if you're knocking around the cab without your seatbelt on, you're going to get really hurt. So that is their best chance of avoiding injury. If God forbid we roll a piece of equipment. We did have an operator who really never wore a seatbelt, and his bulldozer slid down a steep bank, rolled on his side, and his head we don't know if he tried to jump out of the cab or if he fell out of it, but the actual cage of the cab came down on his head and killed him. So, and thankfully this doesn't happen too often, but unfortunately it does happen. And I know these are not pictures of heavy equipment, but I threw this in here because the distracted driving rules should apply to heavy equipment as well. So we want to avoid eating, definitely want to avoid being on the phone. And then I threw these pictures in here. Just this is another account not related to heavy equipment, but they were driving down the road and they had a gate that wasn't completely open and he wasn't watching where he was going. And he ran into the gate and got very lucky as it came through basically the dashboard, the front end of the truck. And he thankfully was not injured, got incredibly lucky. Why I show these pictures is just because we need to be aware of our surroundings, and in a lot of the places where we're working, there is, equipment or buildings or vehicles or, possibly gates that we need to be careful about clipping with the equipment. So the employer is responsible for providing the right equipment for the job and maintaining it. They're also responsible for training the employee on the hazards of the equipment and in safe work practices, and they're responsible to respond to and correct the hazards pointed out by the worker, as they're found on, the pre-trip inspections or just through the workday. The employer or the employee is responsible to only operate the equipment they're authorized and trained to operate, and they're required to operate according to the manufacturer's guidelines. They're required to read and follow all the warning labels, and they're required to operate it responsibly so there are no hazards created for themselves and for other workers. And then they're required to correct the hazards they're able to, and then reporting the hazards that they're not able to correct. So there's lots on this, always remember. I'll try to get through this. I think there's 3 or 4 pages of this, because as I was putting this together, more and more things come up. We've got to do an inspection every single day. We can't run a piece of equipment with serious defects on it that affect the safe operation. I do have an account where they've been running a piece of equipment that has no brakes, and they stop it by running the blade into the ground or running into stacks of product. Got to make sure there's an extinguisher on there that's operational and fully charged. We need to make sure we have an operator's guide or manual. It doesn't have to be on the machine, but we need to have one, electronically, if nothing else. We've got to operate the equipment to the manufacturer's guidelines and recommendations, and we've got to use seatbelt. I highly, highly recommend that you require hearing protection when you're operating equipment. We got to keep, cans and tools, and just got to keep the cabs clean. Got to keep them free of just crap. We've got to be aware of the blind spots. And we can't be putting any part of our body while we're got a load suspended or a piece of that equipment or an attachment up in the air. We cannot be putting any part of our body, even for a second, underneath that. And we did have a fatality last year where basically a piece of equipment came down on somebody. So it's happening, but we've really got to drive this point home, not just for our operators, but for our folks on the ground too. 3 points of contact when you're getting on and off the thing. When you park it, they have to set the parking brake, turn it off, put the blades or put the forks or whatever it is on the ground, and, shut it off, put it in gear. We can't have the thing rolling away from us, because that does happen. We've got to teach our folks to make eye contact, get communication with the operator, even if it's just waving at them until they acknowledge we're there, or, we get their approval to approach the machine. And don't stand, directly behind or the wheels of the tracks, while you're talking to the operator, because their foot can slip off a pedal. They can be, trying to set the parking brake and their foot comes off and they roll over somebody. And just be real careful. Once again, we've got to teach our folks on the ground too, to not get in the swing radius of the path of these pieces of equipment. So spotters, we may need to have a spotter depending on, could be power lines, could be equipment, could be a building. We could be carrying something where we've got really severely limited, or completely restricted visibility. When we have spotters, we've got to talk about where they stand, and we need to agree on the hand signals. And you don't have to use these. These are just a suggestion, but we've got to agree on the hand signals ahead of time. And if nothing else, what the hand signal is for, an emergency stop. And we will occasionally have to use spotters. If we can, when we're working with this, if we can put a perimeter up to control, people walking onto, where we're working with this heavy equipment, that would be ideal. It's not always possible or even plausible, but that's just a nice to have. It's not required. For cranes, I want to throw some hand signals in here. I don't know how many of us are dealing with these, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I just want it to be available if we do have people using cranes or hoists like this or boom trucks. But really, I guess my biggest advice would be, from being around heavy equipment for the last 25 years, is know your surroundings. I've seen, really powerful equipment, really, strong, impressive equipment get stuck because we didn't walk where we were going to be working. And so if you can, walk wherever you're going to be driving the equipment beforehand. Give you a sense of where, it's muddy or it's soggy, or if there's even any chance of you going in there. We did have somebody sink a brand new low dollar, an off-road forklift up to the frame as they didn't, they drove out into a field and immediately sunk down in. So, we want to, if we're operating somewhere new, we want to walk it beforehand, but just be aware of clearances of what's above us, what's beside us. And, once again, this is one we have to teach to our operators, and we probably should be teaching it to our folks on the ground as well, too. So rental equipment. It's not that I have anything against rental equipment. It's just that it's generally not well maintained. It's in all likelihood had the people beat the crap out of it because it is a rental. And so that may mean the brakes are bad or that there are leaks, but it has, and this has happened multiple times where a piece of equipment is putting out a huge amount of carbon monoxide, far more than what is allowable, because they're just not maintained and they're not, oh my gosh, they're not adjusted properly. So they're burning up way too much fuel and they're generating a ton of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. So whenever we have rentals, we need to be planning that the exhaust is going to be worse than what we are used to. But the other issue with rental equipment is that we're not, likely we're not going to be familiar with it. It's going to be a different manufacturer. So the controls will be different, different sounds, different blind spots. It's going to have a different capacity because it may be newer or maybe older than what we're used to operating. So, give the operators some time to acclimate to it and get used to it. I do see a bit of that where we get a piece of rental equipment and we throw somebody on it and we've got to, get them going, immediately. We need to give them a little bit of time to get acclimated to that thing. And because it is going to be different than what they're used to. And I highly recommend you have your vendors train your operators. If we're buying a piece of equipment, I would make that absolutely part of the deal is that we want them to come in and train our operators and provide us with materials to train them. I do see a decent amount of stuck heavy equipment, so there's some information on that attached. But you can't ever assume that a single strap or a rope or cable is strong enough. And what I mean by that is we need to be planning that it's going to break, because we don't take into account all three of the resistance factors. So you've got just the rolling resistance of the equipment itself, but then whatever it's stuck in, so the mud or the gravel or whatever it is, and then there's also going to be a gradient of one way or the other that we need to take into account, and we don't want to jerk the thing out because you're gonna increase the chances you're gonna bust that strap or that chain. But we got to make sure that we're attaching to good places too, that it's a place that'll actually hold up. We want to keep the straps of the chains away from sharp edges, protect the windows. If you're using a clevis, it's got to be rated higher than the strap or the chain. No knots. But my best advice on this would be, if you get something stuck, take a minute, stop and breathe, and kind of plan out what you're going to do. And if you feel like it's more than what you're capable of doing, then it is. And I'd hire a professional to get it unstuck, because I see it relatively often where we damage equipment trying to get it unstuck. So here towards the end, we've got to train everybody to not be these guys. Please. I see a lot of tricks or things that they've learned You know, my guys in the bottom left-hand corner there, you don't need to be standing right up next to the 12-foot high tire while they're changing it. You know, the other ones are kind of self-explanatory, but we need to be teaching folks basically kind of where to stand and how to behave and how to operate, and just not to take chances. Even if you did learn a cool trick about how to make the backhoe walk on its rear tires. So if you guys have any questions or concerns, I'll leave this up here for a little bit. You know, like I said, if you can't get the attachments, just email me and I'll get them to you. There's my email address there. There's also the website for PPM. But this picture, this is a massive, massive excavator. And the bucket that this guy's so proudly posing on is about $150,000. And he managed to break that bucket trying to pull probably a boulder out. So yeah, it's I don't know if I would be quite so proud of completely destroying a bucket like that. But anyways, if you guys have any questions, please, you know, feel free to get a hold of me. And there's a bunch of attachments and materials on here for you to help teach your operators and your folks on the ground how to operate and how to behave around heavy equipment. But that is it. I want to thank everybody for attending the webinar, and I'll leave the screen up for just a minute or two longer, and then I'll shut her down. Thanks, guys.